Can you hear me? I don't hear anything yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I do.
There we go. There we go. All right. Hold on one second.
Sure.
There we go. There we go. Hey everyone, what's going on? I'm just going to get into it, I suppose. I want this to be this part won't be in the video we post. This is just for the live stream people who are coming along with us. We're gonna have a conversation with Lynn Alden, a friend of mine from my travails in the Bitcoin world. I actually want this to be like I want this to be a generative conversation. I want to state going into it that I actually I want to hear the steelman of Lynn's perspective on Bitcoin, because I've given a pretty critical view as someone who's an advocate come critic of the project of Bitcoin. I just appeared at the conference in Las Vegas. That's put on by the people at Bitcoin Magazine. I was invited to debate Curtis Yarvin, who advances a view of a view of the good that is I don't see as quite good. In fact, I think his Aristotelian bona fides are made up, as I demonstrated in my riposte to him at the conference. So Bitcoin has actually been a big part of my life, for those who haven't been following along, and I think we're in a new moment as a civilization, as a world, where a lot of stuff is up for grabs. I mean, the shape of the world is changing politically, and I think Lynn believes monetarily. So I'm going to bring her into this conversation. Hey, Lynn, how are you? How's it going?
Good. Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I'm just I switched over to a new streaming thing today. I've been doing this for a while on Substack Live, so you're sort of joining a community of people who follow along with me, who know me but don't know you. So Lynn, why don't you introduce yourself, and tell my audience that I've cultivated, which is outside the Bitcoin audience, who you are and what you do.
Sure. So thanks for having me. My background is initially in engineering. I designed aircraft simulators, eventually shifted toward engineering management and running the finances of the engineering facility. I've had a lifelong interest in investing, so along the side, I wrote a lot online about investing. Things take off sometimes, and so my kind of research business grew so large that I kind of had to leave my engineering work. Um, And so since then, I've been a publisher of investment research for retail and institutional investors. I'm also a general partner at Ego Death Capital. We invest in Bitcoin startups, also some stablecoin stuff, but not really anything broader in crypto. I started covering digital assets in 2017, and I've generally been structurally bullish on Bitcoin, structurally bullish on stable coins, and quite critical of the long tail of almost everything else in the space. I cover macro, I cover digital assets, I cover sometimes individual stocks. That's my background.
Cool. Yeah. So I mean, uh, so Lynn, I mean, you're like a, you're a serious interlocutor, right? I think. I mean, I think you are trying to understand the universe as I am. I think, right? In some honest sense. Um, um, but you and I have, like, I mean, apparent disagreement about um several things, and I wanted to, you know, as you know, so just so we know, Lynn and I know each other personally. Like we've talked outside this. We're not meeting for the first time. Um, uh, and I also don't want to waste anyone's time who's like following along, because I think there's a public conversation that needs to be had on these things. So I'll get right into it. Um, I've put out. I don't believe personally that Bitcoin can be the primary money of civilization. And I have a set of beliefs that stem from my understanding of economics and what I think civilization and politics is, that informs that view. When I consider, as someone who has a, I have a background in software engineering, computer science. So I understand the technology quite well. And as a social institution, I look at it and I say, this, I don't see how we make civilization out of this. And so I don't want to steelman my case so much right now, because I want to give you an opportunity to have some room to sort of like put your case on the table. You have a sort of a thing you say that, nothing stops this train, which is a sort of this call to inevitability, this sort of technological deterministic sort of orientation that, and by the way, I think there's aspects of your macro critique I agree with too. So there'll be there's this places where we can kind of sort of meet and nod. But I want to be very like, I want to have this conversation like a scalpel, right? Because I don't disagree with everything you say. There are specific things I disagree with, and I want to just like paint that map. But the general object I want to put on the table is, I don't think Bitcoin is a currency for civilization. Your response?
Sure. I mean, yeah, a lot there. For starters, when I say nothing stops this train, that's specifically about the U.S. fiscal deficit. Sometimes
Yeah.
people take it to mean other things. So there's kind of a determinism aspect to the deficit because so much of it
Yeah.
is structural. Of course, that has investment implications.
Hmm.
Um, but again, sometimes people apply it to Bitcoin in a way that it's not meant to be. As far as kind of I do think that technology is the biggest driver of change. One thing I say in my book, Broken Money, is to paraphrase that basically political decisions affect things temporarily and locally, whereas technological changes generally affect things globally and more
Hmm.
permanently, at least until one asteroid, wipes us all out or whatever, and we reverse. And so, for example, when you invent refrigeration, that spreads everywhere,
Hmm.
and now we permanently have refrigeration now. Whereas if you make a political decision, it affects a certain amount of space and time, and it can eventually be reversed. And of course, some technology applies to money. Um, and I guess we can explore your claim in detail. I mean, you're the one that kind of wanted this discussion. I'm happy to have it. My general view is I don't go around trying to convince people of everything. I think I provide research on the topic. I invest my own money. I
Hmm.
I propose portfolios that have done quite well that many people choose to follow
Hmm.
or take pieces of. So I'm not really in a position where I feel like I have to go around convincing people that Bitcoin's going to be the future of money. I'm not even sure, there's that claim of hyper Bitcoinization that one day it'll be like the only money or
Hmm.
by far the largest money. I'm somewhat agnostic on that view. My general view is that the total addressable market of Bitcoin is immense. I think it is a fine settlement and monetary network that certainly could
Hmm.
be the dominant money in the world. I think I would like to see it, but I think that's any sort of investment implications I do are 5 to 10 year views. I think technology changes so much, whether we talk about AI or robotics or energy or money or geopolitics. My structural views have kind of a firm opinion on what the next decade looks like. I don't try to predict what things are going to look like in 21, 26, let
Yeah.
alone half that time.
Yeah.
But
So
I do think.
can we like talk about like why like what why would you want to see Bitcoin be the sort of premier monetary asset on the third planet from the sun?
Sure, because I think it is an open source, decentralized ledger
Hmm.
that does not have inherent debasement built into it.
Hmm.
It's permissionless as part of its
When you
open
say
source
debasement,
aspect.
can we stop on that for a second? Like, um,
Sure.
um, so I mean, I want to like not to so just for people following along who don't understand monetary theory, um, when we say debasement, we're talking about the fact that there's no limit to the supply that in our system today, the regulated banks and the Federal Reserve System are able to make loans, which essentially creates new money. This means in essence that the supply of US dollars is not bounded by any natural constraint. There's no algorithm. It's there's like the rate of money creation is constrained by Federal Reserve policy of the overnight like interbank lending rate system. It's like very sophisticated and complicated, but like ultimately there's no ceiling. Like you just like make more money. We call it printing. It's not really printing. It's more of a Rube Goldberg machine of creation of debt and a calculation um of like time, the time money thing of deposit duration and stuff, and all this happens, and this is that's money, your deposits get rehypothecated, and this is the fiat system. This is a system that you critique, and so when you say debasement, you mean that like the supply is allowed to increase in the main. Now, like, so this so my question is like, are you of the sort of like structural belief that like inflation is of the monetary supply? I don't necessarily mean of the price level. Price, we can talk about these things in like separate macro terms. Is it your view that that's always bad, and why?
Right. So I was in the process of kind of saying a little bit more, but I'll kind of get back on point there. So basically, because if we jump around too quickly, I can't make a full point. We're kind of
Okay.
I was mid. So basically, I'll finish up the earlier part and then jump into that. So basically, people they operate on ledgers. That's how money works. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's nature based ledgers like gold and silver, and of course nowadays it's fiat ledgers.
Hmm.
There's something like 160 currencies in the world.
Hmm.
Most of them are these little local ledgers.
Yeah.
And they are generally imposed in the sense that they have pretty tight controls around their border for physical media entering through ports of entry, as well
Hmm.
as the bank transfer system. And
Hmm.
so, for example, and part of the reason we're having this discussion on a weekend is because I'll be flying to Egypt tomorrow, where I
Hmm.
live part of each year. And for example, in the United States, we have something like 7% long-term annual money supply growth, broad
Hmm.
money.
Yeah.
It accelerated during COVID. Sometimes, like in the
Hmm.
90s, it was slower. The average is something like 7%, which is pretty much in line with a developed country in the past 50 plus years. Developing countries like Egypt are often usually in the double digits.
Hmm.
Egypt is often more than 20% supply growth. And what that means on people is that not only are their savings debased, their unit of account is debased, meaning that every contract in the country constantly has to readjust to keep
Mhm.
up with the new reality of, in Egypt's case, 20% new units of money being created and
Yeah.
compounding exponentially every year. So everyone's wages, every business and their prices have to be on this treadmill to keep up.
Mhm.
And in the U.S., it's a little bit less visible because it's 7% is easier to deal with than 27%. But of course, there's a spectrum among the 100 plus currencies in the
But
world.
do we but here's a question, like, do we get benefits from that, right? Like, are there benefits to society from I don't disagree. Like, here's the thing, right? Like Keynesian economists, right, which, the Austrian school is hostile to, wouldn't like sort of deny the descriptive take that like inflation debases things in the way that you say, but they would argue that like the increased risk taking and entrepreneurial activity that comes from all of this like cheaper money, that yes, like does raise price levels on average, leads to productivity gains that like create more overall wealth. Like, this is the sort of the Keynesian view, right? This is the John Maynard Keynes view, and the Austrian view looks at this and sees a sort of like pathology, like a sort of like a moral sin being committed. And I personally, like I am like intuitively Keynesian, like not because I've been trained as a Keynesian, but because like my metaphysical sort of view of the world and the economy has always sort of just kind of been like, yeah, like aren't we just like we're kind of all just like making this up and playing a big game at some level, right? Like we have the economy and then like there's like aesthetics and culture and stuff like that, like all on top, right? Like look what we're doing now. Like people are paying me to do this. I don't know why, but they are. And so like I mean, and so this idea that the sort of the normative dimension of like what value even is kind of makes me sort of like spiritually Keynesian. And so like tell me like why I'm wrong to feel that way.
Well, I would reframe it as this. When you have rapidly debasing money,
Mhm.
especially when that debasement is it's not a metallurgical reality, like we
Mhm.
discovered a new gold deposit for the first time
Yeah.
in a new continent, but rather that we're using a ledger controlled by humans,
Mhm.
and they can rapidly do policies that substantially increase the number of units and therefore affect every contract in that country and everyone's
Yeah.
savings in the country.
Mhm.
What we're doing is we're giving more power to the central administrators of that ledger.
Mhm.
Now, so from if you're a policymaker or kind of pro policymaker, you'd say that's a good thing. Nation states should have more control over all the contracts in their country, all the
Mhm.
businesses happening. Whereas people that are more critical of central policymakers would say, that's quite a lot of power.
Mhm.
That they already have the military power. They already have many other forms of concentrated power.
Mhm.
That also having them control the ledger that literally affects
Mhm.
every contract in the country and
Mhm.
everyone's ability to save, and also
Yeah.
not just debase, but also permission their assets. They can freeze bank accounts. They set all the rules for how the centralized banking system works. They control the most of the border flows where
Mhm.
possible. Um, that's quite a lot of power. So in the hands of someone that happens to be, the philosopher king, right?
Yep.
There are
Yep.
outcomes where that could work out okay.
Yeah.
But I think, especially when you look at, again, 100 plus countries around the world, in the time stretch that we've had this available,
Mhm.
to use Egypt, for example, they've used their centralized ledger to build what critics have kind of called a ghost city. So a new capital that is the tallest building in Africa, roughly the size of the Empire State Building, kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's a city that's largely empty. They are, for example, they're building a nuclear power plant, which is
Mhm.
good, but they started that after they built the ghost city. So this is like a lot of central planning is going on to this. And critics would say, well, these are big vanity projects that the government's deciding to do versus more utilitarian things. And the problem is that when you have 100 plus countries in the world and all the governments are controlling their ledgers, they can continually debase things, and the citizens are kind of have no expectation. They don't really have a way out other than hoping that their policymakers do things well.
Yeah. Well,
And
I
so
mean,
I think
there's no look. I think like there's no like we know the example of Zimbabwe. You know, a historical example that I'm deeply familiar with because I'm a scholar of the first part of the 20th century. The collapse of the Deutschmark, for those who don't know, which I think was quite instrumental in bringing the rise of Nazi Germany, was brought about through the printing of money, basically, which happened as a result of um, the insolvency of the Weimar regime, which was kind of an insolvency that was imposed upon them as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought an end to the First World War. The Weimar Republic began basically printing money to pay back its war reparations, and this collapsed the Deutschmark, and we get the the stories of people bringing wheelbarrows of money right down the street to pay for groceries in Berlin, um, which wasn't really that much of an exaggeration. It was a complete collapse of the German monetary order. Now Keynes was sort of like around for this, right? And he saw it wasn't like the Keynesian school isn't aware of the idea that when political interests capture control of the ledger, that what happens is the laws of supply and demand kick in, and if you have an oversupply of money, like prices are just going to go wacky. Like, I mean, Keynesians don't, like, my Keynesian institution doesn't like deny this. Like, I understand this. Like, this happens. Of course, do not do this. This is why I think Jerome Powell protecting his independence from Donald Trump is really important. It's important that there isn't an institutional alignment between the people who want to spend the money and the people who lend the money. You don't want that to happen. This is why central bank independence is such an important idea in the political economy. But I agree that like that's a a political economic pathology that can happen, but it doesn't tell me that like the ideal monetary order is one of fixed supply of only 21 million Bitcoin in that particular case, right? I think that leads to a bunch of other pathologies that Keynes identified as the paradox of thrift, a whole bunch of other things like capital stock depreciation, like all these like weird sort of like things that central banks sort of like fight against, and like Japanese central
right.
bank being a great example of this over the last like 2 decades. So like how do you like think about those features of the Keynesian argument?
Right. So I'll answer that a little bit in Socratic method by asking you a couple of questions. Do you think people should
Sure.
be able to choose their own money to hold or pay with or receive?
Not necessarily.
And what is the justification for that? Like what
Well, I mean,
who
I
should
mean,
think
it's
like
like it's
if,
like, do I? There's a lot of things I don't choose about like the political institutions. Like, I don't I don't choose the laws that I have to obey, right? I mean, it's part of this gets back to social contract theory,
right.
John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, which like we can talk about that. Like, I think I can make a justification for that, but I'm happy to answer more questions.
Right. So you're the short answer, you don't believe people should, be able to free to choose whatever money they want.
No,
Because the
not
reason I would
necessarily, not
okay,
necessarily. No,
because
like I mean,
so the an
I don't think like I'm allowed. Like I mean, if like I say like you can't like use Russian rubles because like they're evil and they're trying to kill us, and if you use them, then we'll fine you. I'm like, okay, that sounds reasonable. That sounds reasonable for a self-governing republic to do when it's trying to protect its collective interests. Like, sure,
do you
absolutely.
do you think it's reasonable to ban speech?
No, like no. I think that I believe that in order to engage in self government under the theory of the founders, in the tradition, the tradition of English liberty, which precedes the American experiment, which builds on and expands it. I think the pursuit of truth is sort of the summum bonum of our civilizational project, which means that like we should, you and I, like what you and I are doing, dialoguing, trying to search for truth, is something that must be allowed and not subject to the discretion of sort of like
What
arbitrary
if the state
authority.
what if the state views some type of speech as harmful to its existence in a similar way that using certain types of monies might be harmful to that state's existence? Where do you draw the line philosophically between those
Well,
two?
I mean, there's an entire like, there's an entire set of thinking here and in liberal philosophy about like where you draw the line.
Sure.
Um, the modern sort of the what most liberal philosophers think, including myself, is that that criticism and political speech is like, and we can define what we mean by that, is the most like important and sacred speech that the government should never be able to restrict, right? It turns out that we do have restrictions on speech that we have allowed within liberal theory, things like copyright.
In
We
incitement to
we
violence. Yeah.
incitement to violence. We allow people to seek compensation for damages that stem from defamation, libel. Those are civil penalties, by the way, not criminal. These are not, and so you try to like say, so like the standard that exists in the British common law tradition there, right, is the standard of actual malice. This idea that like you're sort of like not using your speech like as a like in the service of truth, but in order to sort of do harm, to cast harm on somebody through lie, through the destruction of truth. And so we say, like, in the sort of the common law tradition and in sort of liberal theory, that like that there should be some sort of like well um there should be due process and standards, and we have citizen juries to adjudicate the facts of such a claim. But like we say, yes, we can have some like reasonable constraints there, and none of those have to do with sort of speaking truth to power. That's not speaking truth to power. It's a different category. And we say, should I be able to criticize the president? Yes, every day, like this idea that there should be any restriction on that just doesn't like show up for me in liberal theory as something
Right.
that is available for restriction.
So one more question.
Okay,
Do you think that technology can change what rules even make sense over time? For example, or what
absolutely.
forms of so for example, just for the audience, like democracy over long distances is quite
Hmm.
hard before you have a printing press and the telegraph. Like if
Hmm.
information is just very limited, it's hard to have say a continent-wide democracy, for example. It wasn't an accident
Yeah.
that most attempts at democracy were quite geographically small before we had faster movement of information. And would you then think that technology can impact what things government even can conceivably control, let alone what they should control?
Yeah. So if this brings to mind, thinking about our founders. And if you go to Washington D.C. and you go across the Potomac, you go to the Jefferson Memorial, you'll find on the southeast wall of the Jefferson Memorial, Jefferson has his he has this famous observation, which sort of I think answers your question, where he says, I'm not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. And as that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as more discoveries are made, new truths are discovered, and manners and opinions change with the change in circumstances, institutions must also advance to keep pace with the time. He went on to say that we might as well require a man to still the coat which fitted him as a boy in a civilized society to remain under the regime of their barbarous ancestors. So Jefferson agrees with you that as like as like time and custom advances, that the nature of the Constitution, the nature of liberty changes. This. So yes, I agree with this. Um, Now the question then comes like on something like Bitcoin or like this idea of sort of a stateless monetary order. Is that something that I can sort of digest inside of like liberal ethics? And I have a bunch of critiques like in that direction where I say I don't think I can. I think there's some problems here that I can't fix with the idea that like Bitcoin exists outside of the democratic polity's ability to control. That's my
Right. Thank you. So going back to your earlier question, like where would my intuitions differ from you? One, well, I generally, on average, I think would view as I have a more limited view of government than you,
okay.
which is to say that I think that attempts to mandate that everybody in a country use a currency and to
Mhm.
take all these actions to try to restrict them from using better currencies that are
Mhm.
preserving their own purchasing power or contracts is generally unethical. But
Mhm.
more so that as technology changes,
Why
I
is it on
support.
that? Why like we there's like a lot of things that like we
Right.
restrict in economic life like of people. Like I'm not allowed there's a lot of economic activities that you and I will go to jail if we try to engage in them, but they could be properly described as economic. Like what like so
Right.
there's a normative character to any economic action, and that normative character of that is something that we adjudicate through democratic deliberation, like surely.
Sure, that's why, for example, I support laws that protect life and property, that basically
Mhm.
prevent people from doing harm to others, including stealing from them,
Mhm.
but
But
not
define
in
what harm
generally.
is. Like define what harm is. Like harm. Harm is something that like is once again is a normative concept, right? Like
Right.
I mean CO2 into the atmosphere. So there a lot of people, a majority of people it turns out think that's harmful, right, to the ecology of the earth. And so they make a sort of normative claim and they say this economic activity is causing a harm and therefore it justifies government changing the rules of economic life in order to mitigate or remove that harm. Um, like that's like I mean that to me is like that's what we should do, right? That's what I mean this is what the whole like we have government because collective action problems exist, right? This is what Thomas Hobbes, right, in the Leviathan is
Yeah.
saying, right? About like the difference between civilization and the state of nature. That in the state of nature, we find ourselves in a war of all against all. We all have to look out for ourselves. We all have to look out for our own security. We all have to look out for our own like provision of food and shelter and Hobbes is like, well, that's a very shitty life. Like there's no time for philosophy or music or playing around or going to the park. You're spending all of your time making sure that someone doesn't kill you, that you have enough food, that you're going to make it through the winter, and like it's all up to you. It's all on you. I mean that's like Hobbes is basically saying like if you want to be purely libertarian, it's a pretty shitty life. He said it was what like nasty, brutish, and short is the
Sure.
character I think of that
Yeah, my
world.
my case here is not to argue for anarchy as a philosophical point. My argue is that I clearly draw the line a different place than you, which is I would put the restriction on saying that two people cannot choose their own unit of account for a contract or what they save
Mhm.
their value in as comparable to saying that you can't practice this religion. You can't say this thing that is not, not incitement to violence. So I agree with on certain things there, but it's like you can't spread this idea because it's dangerous, or two consenting adults can engage in, say, a homosexual act, right? That
Mhm.
I would. There are certain things that many governments try to ban,
Yeah.
and I would generally put pretty benign contracting decisions among literally millions of individuals and businesses in that category. Now,
Why would
just
you do that? Why would you put a commercial contract in the same category as sexual freedom?
because it's existential, right? So, for example, if someone
Why?
is using it, because if you cannot because it's the ability to feed your family and keep shelter over your head. If you can't save and do commerce
I mean,
properly because the
the
local
government
you
has food assistance programs. They're not
but
trying
let
to
can
like they're not
know,
trying to
can I
prevent me from eating. I don't think that that's what we're doing collectively as
real
a
real quick,
society.
the number of times you interrupt me is much larger than the inverse, and so it's
Okay.
sometimes it's hard to just complete a
Oh,
thought. So, um, for example, in Egypt, if someone is dealing with a 25% annual increasing unit of account all the time,
yeah. Yeah,
year
that's
after year
okay.
after year, and that's not the worst. I mean, Egypt has managed to go from like the earliest data I have available, like from ever since they overthrew the British, they've not hyperinflated. They've not even had
Mhm.
triple digit inflation. They're not.
Mhm.
It's not even a worst case scenario. This is a pretty normal developing market scenario, and so everyone's using this unit of account. Their savings are just constantly just siphoned away from them.
Mhm.
Every anyone earning a wage has to constantly just try to keep up. Many are debanked, so they're not even earning interest on their savings.
Mhm.
And there are attempts. Of course, many people say, you know what, I want to try to hold dollars. This is so untenable to me that if I keep
Mhm.
doing this, it's like repeating something that it's like trying the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result. And some people say like it's exponential that if I keep pricing things in this currency and especially in savings in this currency, me and my kids are going to be like poor if
Mhm.
we don't get ahead here.
Yeah.
So they say, okay, well, I'm going to try to save money because I want to buy a car in 2 years. So I'm going to save up in dollars, right?
Yeah.
And then the government comes in and tries to stamp out that activity. Or someone says, I want to buy some gold. And that activity is currently somewhat allowed there, but some
Mhm.
countries won't allow it. They'll say, well, that's you're violating our kind of social contract. I'll use this really shitty currency. Um, and so basically, I think it is a natural thing that people will try to gravitate away from rapidly devaluing units.
Mhm.
And I don't want to pick on Egypt here because I mean, it's not the worst, and they're not the most
Mhm.
draconian by any stretch, but they're kind of a standard example. We can use Iran or North Korea as some of the worst examples where you literally
Mhm.
cannot perform economically. It gets so bad at times, um, and the government's kind of thumb on every contract scale, it becomes existential for a lot of people. And so, but then the second point is not whether just they should. I advocate for trying to develop technologies that even just take away the option or add frictions to the government's attempt to just be omnipotent, right? So
Mhm.
if they have the technology, just surveil every transaction, decide
Mhm.
who gets a bank account, debase at
Mhm.
any frequency they want with zero kind of options to escape from it. I would consider that's very draconian and dystopian. And
Mhm.
I would support technologies that try to give individuals more abilities to at least have a negotiation with the government to say, look, if you get really draconian, a lot of us, millions of us, are going to do this thing with this technology that adds a lot of cost to you trying to get in our way if enough of us are doing it. So that we are going to try to take options to kind of preserve our existential economic ability here. And so that's generally, I think, where we have somewhat different intuitions that I think that people naturally will gravitate toward harder monies.
Mhm.
That draconian attempts to kind of surveil everything about them and control everything about their economic life is a step too far, and that even to the extent that countries do it, I would advocate ways to try to limit their ability to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on concerns about financial surveillance, and the idea of financial deplatforming. I mean, like I know, like we both you and I know people who have
Yeah,
lived in countries where this has happened to them, and I don't like, but like I guess like what I'm I agree with like if I'm in like look, I don't like begrudge anyone in Egypt from like buying Bitcoin to like maintain like the value of their savings as the government's like debasing it. Like I would do the same thing. Like it's not I'm not saying they're being like ethically wrong. I mean the conversation I'm having here in my audience is really focused on American politics, not so much as sort
right.
of the international situations, which are different. They're different. They're different regimes. These are
Yeah,
authoritarian regimes. They don't have the same sort of counter majoritarian institutions that like we have here in America. But here in America, I mean, would you abolish the Federal Reserve System and replace it with Bitcoin? Because that's something that I would be very much against as an idea. But like, Offer say even as I say to you that I too would use Bitcoin if I was in Egypt. Like I'm saying, like to me, these two thoughts exist at once. That like we have a system here that an independent central bank, which is, I understand it's not directly under control, but like it's under control in the sense that like Congress could just pass a law to like change the Federal Reserve System if it wanted to. We have a status quo. The polity has sort of rested into this position that was like born in the post-war world, right? You know, the Bretton Woods and the post Bretton Woods regime, um, and like it's a very sophisticated beast, as the world is currently finding. The whole world wants to move off the US dollar right now with everything Trump's doing in the Strait of Hormuz. And they're kind of like, we're seeing how abortive that is. Like even Iran wants access to the US financial system still, as part of this negotiations. The dollar is just so sticky that even Iran still wants to use it. Um, so like, I mean, I think I've seen you said that that you would abolish the Federal Reserve System, and I think that's probably about the worst idea like that we could have, right, politically right now. I mean, anyway, so that like like how, what is your view for the future of the American monetary order?
Right. So I'll get to that in a second. To finish up, kind of, I think, just get to the top level here for kind of put a bow in our prior discussion. I think where we somewhat differ is that, as because you asked me earlier, kind of really going back to an earlier question, what is the problem with debasing money? Like, is that always a bad thing? Could there be areas that it's good? I think a
Yeah.
fundamental issue here is basically that the natural tendency that people have, and it's rational, is to try to gravitate toward money that's not debasing them. They want their contracts to be stable.
Hmm.
They want their savings to either stay neutral or ideally even
Yeah.
appreciate in value. That's what people will naturally try to do. To
Sure.
the extent that a state wants to impose a more inflationary or debasement frequent currency, that requires an increasing set of dystopian steps, especially as that gap widens, right? So if you're trying to impose a dollar that grows at, say, 5% a year compared to gold that grows at 2% a year, you probably need some frictions on gold to make that happen. If you're trying to
Hmm.
impose something that grows at 25% a year, you probably need increasingly dystopian type of things to stop them from gravitating toward these sounder monies. And so I think the problem is that the problem with inflationary money in many cases, in addition to all the symptoms that it causes people by basically rug pulling them of their contracts and their savings and their wages, is that it you have to then constantly add frictions to them to keep
Hmm.
your system in place. That's where I think I would have the biggest objection. If 5 million people in a country decide, and it's a five, let's say it's, I don't know, Norway or Singapore, and they all decide we love our currency. It's, we don't want to use gold or Bitcoin or dollars or anything else. We love our currency, and the government says, great, then use our currency. I'm not going to go there and say, no, no, you have to use gold or Bitcoin. You have to use the sounder money. I would just say that basically what we see in common is that as states want to use more debasing currency, people try to gravitate away from it, and that's where you get kind of financial authoritarianism to varying degrees, whether
But are
whether
we seeing
somewhat
that?
benign or
Are we
or
seeing
pretty
financial
malevolent.
authoritarianism in America? Because like I look at the situation and like we see like let's see what's happening right now with Chairman Powell, right, and the new incoming Fed
Yeah,
chair. I mean, you don't see like even you don't see Wall Street like clamoring to help Trump print a bunch more money. In fact, you see the opposite. You see them kind of being like, fuck, like if Trump is allowed to like lower interest rates, he's going to cause hyperinflation and destroy the financial system. So you actually have the actual banks, like the evil banks that we all hate, are actually the ones who are like, you know, counseling responsibility here and trying to protect the central bank's independence from Donald Trump and a bunch of populists from printing a bunch of money. And like if you say it's like the state doing this, it's not really the state. I mean, you have factions in the system, and one of these factions, Wall Street, seems to have enough self-awareness. They understand that like that the solvency of the dollar and the reputation of the dollar around the world is their entire business. And it actually seems
yeah,
to me they're actually being quite responsible about it. They're like actually trying to figure out a way to like keep interest rate policy where it should be, in order to provide stable prices, which like is not the incentive of Donald Trump and it's not the incentive of politicians, but like isn't that like our like isn't that that's not the state? Like the state isn't operating as like a as like this like evil entity that just like wants to like steal the money from the poor by inflating the price of eggs. No, you're seeing a whole bunch of different factions in the economy that understand what's going on. Even like center left like politicians like Elizabeth Warren understand this too and would like would not be okay with printing absurd amounts of money by lowering interest rates at a time when price levels are rising. So like isn't like our isn't that the system working? I'm not saying it's working well, but it's like it's not acting in this sort of cartoonish sort of like state versus the poor sort of Manichean like picture that like libertarians on this point paint.
Right. So, for example, if we're in the Hunger Games books, it's better to live in the capital than District 12. That's for sure. Right. So the dollar is the best performing currency of the past century. We're the hegemon. We're the biggest empire essentially on the planet. We
Hmm.
have among the most decentralized forms of government in the sense that we have three kind of competing branches. The central bank has pretty significant safeguards, not perfect ones, but a number of safeguards that kind of give it more autonomy than your average developing market central bank. And so, yeah, it's obviously better to have your contracts, your wages, your savings priced in dollars than Egyptian pounds, and it's better to have them in Egyptian pounds than it is to have them in Iranian currency. Right? There's a spectrum here that no one really, I think, would contest. Um, and in the U.S., that's why we need fairly benign attempts to keep people on the dollar. We put capital gains taxes on every other asset in existence, pretty much. So if you invest in real estate, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, and then later sell it, the American system tries to recoup that. Now that does require quite a bit of surveillance. Like they literally surveil you when you buy gold coins. They surveil you when you buy Bitcoin. They surveil your
Hmm.
brokerage account. They have to surveil your entire financial life to do that. So I would say that
Hmm.
the more you get in the limited government spectrum here, the more they would say that that is already a step too far. But that's still a fairly benign thing. They're not banning you from owning gold, which America did in the past for decades. They're not banning you from owning Bitcoin. They're not banning you from owning another currency like euros or whatever, because it's near the top of the stack. So they need fairly, at least compared to others, somewhat benign methods to contain that. The benign methods happen to include ubiquitous financial surveillance for everyone, which we're lucky that our government is not among the worst in the world, because if a government surveils everything you do and happens to be a government that is not a fan of free speech or freedom of religion
Hmm.
or freedom of expression and so forth, then that actually is a massive problem, even that benign type of
Yeah.
control.
This is the
Um,
this is the
and
temporal prisoner's dilemma
yeah,
that libertarians talk about, right?
right. But I
So
would say
so I
we're
mean,
to just real quick to finish the point. So yeah,
yeah.
it's great that we live in the capital, the Hunger Games capital, right? We
Hmm.
we have an easier time. We also putting, let's say Bitcoin and gold didn't exist. I mean, we have the most diverse, most liquid, most attractive stock market in the world that
Hmm.
is a pretty good form of savings. Um, and so we have a lot of options here.
Hmm.
And so, but whereas I think a lot of these principles, when we talk about it, at least I take a global view of things, not just what is good for me and my particular country. Although
Hmm.
I do think I mean, if Americans should own gold rather than bonds, they would have crushed it. They should own stocks rather than just hold cash. Bitcoin's been a great investment. There's a lot of things I think people should hold that you should
Hmm.
gravitate towards
Yeah.
scarcer good things.
Yeah, I mean,
And but when you
I wouldn't, I would, I look, I agree with you about your observation about the fiscal account, right, and the
yeah,
sovereign debt issues that we're looking at in the United States. I think you and I probably will violently agree on the sort of the fiscal picture and where these things are headed, which is um, like maybe why don't we do that? Why don't we move to an area where I think we're just going to we disagree on what the monetary order should be, but I think you and I mean, when I read your stuff about like the fiscal picture and the direction, I'm generally don't have much to disagree with you on. So why don't we talk about the current? uh, deficit in the United States and the current like where we are, which I think is much worse. Even that we were in a bad situation, and now we're in a much worse situation with the Strait of Hormuz crisis. So why don't
Yeah.
we move to more of a more agreeable territory where I think you and I have a similar analytical view on the situation.
Sure. I mean, we can tie that to your prior point, which is that because the U.S. is running pretty big deficits, it obviously matters if someone is on the receiving side of those deficits or on kind of the non-receiving side, right? So if someone is fairly young, starting a family, trying to buy a house, it's a pretty rough time. It's not a surprise that consumer sentiment is currently at record lows in the United States. We somehow hit lower lows than the worst part of COVID, the worst part of 2009, the worst part of the late 70s, and something like 70 years of data. We're at record low consumer sentiment because people are working full time, and yet the number of hours it takes them to buy, the same amount of beef, for example, like
Hmm.
nutritious dense food, or to buy the same house, or to buy an
Hmm.
ounce of gold, or to buy a
Yeah.
share of the S&P 500, or to buy a Bitcoin over a multi-year period. These things have all outpaced their wages. Whereas if you're on the receiving, if you work in healthcare, it's obviously aging demographics. If you work in healthcare, if you work in defense,
Hmm.
you're generally more on the receiving side of deficits. If you are a senior, you're generally on the receiving side of deficits. If you're an asset holder, you're probably not complaining too much because you own all these attractive, scarce assets, and you're generally short the dollar, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if they wanted to base the dollar faster, from a personal standpoint, I'm like, all right, so that's fine with me because that's my liability, and I own things that are scarcer than the dollar, and
One of the
so
things
it
about healthcare, one of the things that was explained to me by an economist about healthcare inflation, and I'm curious on your thoughts, is like one of the reasons why healthcare inflation is such a problem in this country has a lot to do with the fact that because healthcare is it's like the most like labor intensive
yeah,
industry in the sense that like you have to have like the number of people that you have to have per patient, like as like a per customer ratio, is like the highest. You have to have nurses and staffs and stuff, and this creates this like this is like why like productivity growth in like healthcare has basically been like zero, like for decades, and so like inflation happens not because of monetary pressure, but because like the healthcare industry needs more people the older the population gets, and that means that the healthcare sector has to compete with other sectors for in the labor pool, by offering higher and higher wages to come be a nurse rather than go learn how to code. And this actually has actually been the biggest factor driving healthcare inflation, not just in the United States, but across the entire developed world. Because the fact is like if there's more patients, you need more labor, and more labor means you're using a bigger part of the labor pool, and this is why healthcare costs are actually spiraling out of control. It's not the evil insurance companies; it's the fact that like this might actually be a time where like we need robots to take care of people because like we just have a dwindling labor pool against ever increasing patient demand.
I mostly agree with a caveat. So it is true that basically when you look at inflation over, call it, the past 25 years, so we have this money supply growth, but that money doesn't make every price go up equally. So things like electronics, anything that Moore's law affects, software, automation, offshoring, these things we've gotten radically better, more productive at making things. So the prices don't go to textiles and TVs and things like that. Where they do show up is, as to your point, things that are labor intensive, education, healthcare, things like that, as well as things that have some degree of scarcity. So gold, houses, especially waterfront houses, fine art, Bitcoin, anything that has some degree of scarcity to it and is also attractive. I mean, you can have something that's scarce, but no one wants it. But so it's that's scarce and kind of the leading thing, whatever it's doing, its field. That's generally where prices show up in healthcare. We've not gotten much more efficient at it. The part where I would somewhat disagree is that there's obviously a very lack of evenness here. So, for example, in Japan, they're something like 10 years older than us on average. They spend way less
Mhm.
per capita on healthcare, and they live longer. Europe on average
But they
spends
they
less
are
per
facing they
capita.
are facing a staffing crisis, actually. I
They
was
are.
just reading
Yeah.
how they're, like, investing in robots right now because they're worried that they don't have enough nurses and doctors, like, in the next 10 years because of that because of the aging situation. It's actually a
Yeah,
real crisis there. Like, they're,
it
like,
is.
trying to
It
f
is.
yeah.
Yeah, but I'm saying that it is somewhat heterogeneous country by country, right? That just because these universal things are true, which is that unless we have technology breakthroughs like robots and stuff, healthcare is labor intensive, and also very complex science is involved as well, which is research is very expensive. So all that is universally true, but there are differences in whether or not price discovery is allowed to happen well, whether drugs are overpriced in one country and then therefore the same drug is way cheaper in another country. These are all heterogeneous realities. I would say that
Mhm.
this is a macro discussion that I think is somewhat tangential to the kind of the core point of the discussion around
Yeah.
money. But I don't think we have major disagreements on kind of why healthcare prices go up substantially.
Yeah. Well, coming back to the sort of the main thread that I wanted to point towards, which is the fiscal deficit, in the United States. I think this is like, I mean, I think there's like an personally, I think there's an unavoidable financial crisis that's coming at us. Um,
Yeah.
uh, I think it's interesting because I think the whole world is sort of in a, in a Mexican standoff with the dollar system, and like everyone kind of stands to lose, like even including China, right? Like as much as China's like trying to create like create using the yuan for trade, like it's such a tiny percentage of like of of the actual trade on the oceans. Like even Brazil's attempts to like trade in yuan, they're just like the amount of liquidity that's available to them is just a pittance. Like you look at it's like 2 or 3% of the overall trade is like priced in yuan. It just all still ends up in dollars despite Beijing and and Brazil, committed to getting the dollar out of the loop. They've made very little progress because of there is just the depth of those markets are just not there, and China's struggling to develop them. So I mean, like I don't know, like the federal government is facing a solvency crisis, and the world, even like the people who hate the dollar the most, are like barely able to make any progress despite massive attempts at it. So the question is like, how does this, like, we haven't seen anything like this in world history before. Like the question is what is the like a end game here? Because like like it looks to me like if the dollar goes down, the whole global economy goes down with it, like including the Chinese economy, like there like everything breaks on the planet. So where like how do you see this playing out in the coming years?
Well, all right, so if you kind of where we got to this point, so I agree with you that all these attempts to get around the dollar are very slow, and that's because network effects matter, not just in money, but that's why any competitor to social media inherently has an uphill battle because network effects matter. And so when it comes to money, it's arguably the biggest network effect of all. And one of the biggest enforcers of that network effect is the fact that in the dollar's case, there's something like $18 trillion worth of cross-border loans and bonds, excluding the U.S. Meaning that
Yeah.
and it's often not even owed to the U.S. Like a entity in France will lend dollars to an entity in Brazil, for example.
Yeah.
And an entity in China will lend to a country, an entity in Nigeria. And so across border, there's this very entwined set of dollar debt. And all of that represents inflexible demand for dollars because that's what
Mhm.
services their interest and then their eventual principal repayment and re-leveraging. Um, and so that's kind of part of why, other than catastrophic war or nonlinear legal defaults and like legal resets, this system doesn't end quickly, unlike a struggling emerging market. Because a struggling emerging market has very little external demand for its currency. If they mess up their ledger, it can blow up very quickly. In the dollar's case, we have a very long runway because of all this inflexible demand for dollars. Now, there have been attempts to go around it that it started to become successful. For example, before Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe was buying a lot of its increasing ratios of its natural gas from Russia in euros. There
Mhm.
was like a charter, just a linear increase in
Yeah.
euro payments rather than dollar payments. That, of course, all got disrupted
Yeah.
because of the war. But then we saw, like a lot of Russia's energy, shipments to China are obviously increasingly non-dollar because they're sanctioned and stuff like that. So
Mhm. But those are
uh,
very small
they're
markets relative to the global market. Like those
small,
are
but yes,
and those are gray markets in some cases
right,
that are actually sanctioned by a large portion of the world as well. So like you wouldn't, of course they're going to use like the non, you know, like they're not going to be able to use the U.S. financial system because they're fighting wars
yeah.
and against the interests of the United States.
Yeah, small but critical. When you have the world's biggest, one of the world's biggest kind of commodity and energy producers, and one of the world's biggest commodity and energy importers, and the fact that they're able to do non-dollar trade, that's a small, but it's like a key tendon in a body. It's small, but it's very important for the functioning of what's going on, and that's what's happening there. So there are, especially in critical points, successes at going around the dollar, but it's a very small percentage of global trade. The other factor is that there's some degree of diversification of reserve assets, which is that, really for the past 10 years, official kind of central bank holdings of treasuries have not really increased. They
Mhm.
have around the margins added tonnage to gold. And then when you have a combination of public and private sector buying gold, the price has obviously gone up quite a bit. And so when you look at a percentage of countries' reserves, gold is now a much larger percentage than
But
it
we're
was for
we're
for
no close. I mean,
many
we're
average
we're
decades.
we're. I mean, this has happened before, right? I mean, in the 1970s, there was a massive movement around the world, around
Yeah.
the oil shock and the oil crisis to move off the US dollar. There was even like some like European countries that were flirting with it. And in fact, like the amount of deleveraging of the dollar that happened in the late 70s, early 80s before the Volcker shock and stuff like that was actually higher than today. Like we're like global, like we're like if you like look at the long-term chart of like of it, like the the last global deleveraging of the US dollar was like far, far, far more significant in terms of percentages of reserves in the 70s than what we're seeing today. We're seeing this drip, drip, drip. I mean, so like we've been through this before. I mean, the world tried to basically move off like the dollar in the 70s after the end of Bretton Woods, and everyone was super pissed off that the gold window got 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 closed, and there was like an
Yeah.
actual real there was a real concerted global effort to try and de-risk the dollar, and then it just kind of all went back, and the 80s and 90s came, and the Soviet Union fell, and then we kind of like have moved to like a new high watermark that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, by
And
most metrics, the high watermark of dollarization was in the late 90s, early 2000s.
yeah,
That's after the Soviet Union fell. We were basically a hyperpower. Our military was uncontested. Our industrial base was still pretty uncontested. Um, it was the industrial base was the part that was becoming contested. Now we're in a world where China is the biggest trade partner with most countries in the world. That's rapidly changed over the past 20 years. Um, and to your point, I mean, so the gold share, for example, of reserves is the largest it's been in decades. It's not as large as it was in the 70s, right? So the trend is that from Bretton Woods ever to about 2009 or so, you had structurally kind of rising dollar shares of global reserves and shrinking gold. Since then, you've had this kind of flatlining of gold and then a rising share of
yeah.
gold. And now it's actually now with the combination of tonnage increases and price increases, we've actually we've hit kind of a multi-decade high of gold reserves. Now, my point here is that I think the longer term arc here is that reserves will gradually diversify, including with a focus on neutral reserve assets like gold, as well as wherever it's critical, there will be bilateral payment agreements that are outside the dollars if
Yeah.
they feel that they have to. And to kind of finish up, generally speaking, whenever we have an emerging market boom, it happens during a 3 to 5 year period where the dollar devalues significantly compared to other major currencies. And that's because emerging markets are historically pretty dollar indebted. And so when you devalue the dollar sharply, they generally experience an economic boom. It's
Mhm.
kind of like if you borrowed a mortgage in pesos, and then the peso gets cut in half in value, you now have a lot more
Yeah.
spending power. You're doing great.
But
And
but
so that
for
happens in
China,
emerging.
China has like real issues here though. Like I mean, the demand for yuan around the world, other than like enemies of the United States, like people who
Oh yeah,
are
they have no shot. They have no shot at replacing the dollar.
they have
No,
they
there's
have
no there's no
they
there's there's
there
no there's no fiat
nobody wants
currency that's
yuan.
big enough.
There's the
Yeah.
capital controls are insane. Like it's hard to take money out of China. It's hard to convert. It's hard to China uh, China like you talk about financial deplatforming, but like the capital controls that are on yuan conversions is insane. And like you hear horror stories of like of expats and stuff like that trying to get their their money out of China when they leave China and stuff. And there's a whole bureaucratic process for getting permission for the bank to like actually convert to dollars and then move out. It's like, whereas the US at least has the advantage of like people can move in and out of dollars anywhere in the world and it's just easy to do. And the US government isn't requiring you to get like a fucking like license. Like even Brazil, like for I think for over $10,000 US you have to get like a permit from some like government regulator to be able to like send more than that out of the country. The US is like pretty unique, right? Even the European Union, which is like a pretty open market, like they are still a little bit more frictiony than the US in terms of like
And Europe
um
Europe also does not have they have a fragmented securities market. So even if someone uses the euro, and they want to store it longer term, they don't have a unified bond market in the way that the U.S. has, right? So there's no whether it's the euro, the yuan, the yen, or any others. There's no fiat currency that's in anywhere near replacing the dollar, even in a 50-year period. There's just no currency big enough, because we've gotten to the point where the world was very centralized,
yeah.
in terms of say GDP, because I mean after a century of a long period of colonization, global war, attempts at communism, and then finally kind of breaking out of that. So we've had kind of a re-rise of China and India and the East broadly as economic powerhouses,
Mhm.
as part of kind of this global diversification.
But if I
There's
can
no
just point out,
currency.
if I can just point on that, not to interrupt you, but just to hung on this point, this is a very important institutional stance about the U.S. dollar that goes unappreciated. The U.S. financial regulatory system operates, with the exception of the sanctions regime, for the most part, ops operates on a post hoc enforcement basis, meaning like if I want to wire $1 billion to Saudi Arabia, it might cause a suspicious activity report and somebody at the Department of Justice might look into it next week, but like the wire will go through, right? Like the money will get there. I might get caught for doing something bad after the fact, but like the US system operates on a sort of like you do the transaction first and then we investigate and get you later. A lot of the rest of the world isn't like that, right? The Chinese system is not like that. A lot of aspects of the
Yeah,
European system are not like that, where you actually have to ask permission from the government first before doing a certain kind of transaction. We don't do
yeah.
that. Our regulatory posture is always post hoc enforcement, which actually makes the dollar like really, really easy to use for everybody versus the rest of the world. And this is just something that like authoritarian regimes just like don't want to allow. It's like it's scary for them, right? They don't want to allow like their democratic opposition to wire money around and stuff like that. This gives the fact that the United States is on this post hoc enforcement posture is actually like something that's quite unique, right? That we're just sort of like, we'll
Yeah.
like and that's like something I think a lot of people when they criticize the dollar versus other currencies don't recognize about the institutional posture of the
Right, but
dollar.
that's of course not what I'm doing here. I'm not comparing the dollar to other
Yeah.
currencies. I'm kind of comparing it to the global set of options that they have, which is one, own neutral reserve assets. That's why there's been increased interest in gold and also repatriating their gold, not holding their gold in
Yeah.
New York, but actually repatriating it. And two, around the margins, diversifying the currencies they use, not because they say this other currency is better, but because they say if we should be on the wrong side of the US, what percentage of our reserves and what percentage of our payment abilities are could be shut off at the stroke of a pen. And so we want to have some options outside of that. And that's why we see a generally very slowly diversifying global financial system.
Mhm.
But now, of course, where it gets more complex is that, even the dollar system as structured, is not all benefit to the U.S. It's very hard to have an industrial base when you're the reserve currency and it's cumulative, right? So it's not the same as the 70s or 80s because this adds up, which is that in order for the whole world to use dollars, we
Yes.
have to supply the world with dollars. And we do that through structural trade deficits, which generally starts from our lower margin stuff and goes up from there. So our highest margin stuff, basically exporting dollar securities, technology, healthcare. That's generally not
Yeah.
that none of that's the first
Which,
stuff impacted.
which,
It's
by
the
the way,
lower
though,
margin manufacturing.
which I think in an idealized world where all the world were like democracies and got along and had like relatively like harmonized trade rules and taxation rules, you could do that forever, really. Like the real issues, I think, around like the US losing its manufacturing base to China are ultimately matters of national security, like ultimately, right? Like in theory, like a country like the United States, if China was like a big, happy, liberal, democratic trading partner and they wanted to focus on manufacturing, we want to work on services, I mean, we could plug the hole of like manufacturing decline with wealth transfer. Like we could invest a lot, we could tax a lot more money on higher value services, like higher value chain services, and like invest in like a heavier welfare state affordably, right? Like in theory. So like you wouldn't like you could do that, but we live in a different world where China's actually a malign actor and would like to kill us if they could. And we're in this like weird like frenemy relationship with them. They don't all want to kill us, but I mean like some of the CCP, some of the hardliners in the Chinese Communist Party want to kill us. But like to me, that's like actually like the distinction, not that arrangement that we export money more than we export goods is the problem. Like you can use that like you could fill in the gaps in terms of like wealth disparity, like if you weren't spending 100 1 point whatever trillion on a military and stuff and running all these structural account deficits. Like I don't think that that's morally wrong, obviously, to come back to sort of like our sort of like disagreement on the normative perspective into these things.
Well, I would say it's a little bit more complicated than that because a couple things. One is as we do that, every year that we're exporting dollars, the world then they don't just hold, they don't have just stacks of dollars everywhere. They reinvest those dollars,
Yeah.
generally into our stock market, into our real estate, into
Yeah.
our debt markets. So they actually own a larger and larger share of our corporations, a larger and larger
Hmm.
share of our just property, or larger and larger share of our private equity, which of course gives them increasing voting rights on all of that.
Yep.
And so we basically are selling appreciating chunks of our capital markets for what is generally depreciating assets, and this accumulates over time. Two, the kind of attempt to correct that. So your point that because we live in a world where we kind of want our own industrial base too, because we have adversaries with very large industrial bases. That's the kind of the reality on the ground. Even if somehow we didn't have that, what you propose is generally a pretty centralizing force, saying that because we have such a big imbalance put in place, we have to have this another really big kind of flow of capital to take from one part of the economy and put in another part of the economy, and then we have to hope that policymakers are dialing all those knobs correctly to kind of balance that appropriately. And to whatever extent you go by and cumulatively you're not doing that, it's not a surprise that we have kind of record high political polarization in the U.S. Because some zip codes that are in the business of exporting securities and tech and healthcare have been fine in this arrangement, or defense, and zip codes that are in the historical business of exporting goods
Hmm.
have generally been more impaired, or doing services that like if you're a restaurant in an area that is a manufacturing hub, even though you're not
But is that
manufacturing, you're
describe?
still
But
impaired.
is that? But that's not pure like. But if you take that like logic to its like conclusion, you're
Yeah.
basically saying that we should have had a monetary order that never would have allowed for, a the international trade, like international trade dynamics that created, national level specialization, like comparative advantage between, you know, certain economies that like might be more well suited to mass manufacturing because they have a lot more unskilled labor, and so like how do you like I this is the thing I don't I mean this is like the one big difference I have with like when it comes to trade theory between Austrians and the rest of the economic mainstream is there's actually like a sort of an this sort of like this sort of like soft autarky view that Austrians have that I don't quite understand when it comes to this sort of this idea that like we shouldn't seek comparative advantage between nations between like what why is it bad in like not I mean I think it's bad that we moved all our manufacturing to China because they're a totalitarian dictatorship. Had we moved it to like most of it to like Mexico, I actually think the world would be a much better place, both Mexico and the United States, even if we had a trade deficit with them. Why like am I wrong to think that?
Well, Mexico is a much smaller population than China. It's not an accident. It's not random where it showed up. I mean, generally, it's going to show
Yeah.
up in the biggest population centers that are also not doing something that severely impacts their own manufacturing. Um, to prior points, so it is true that, for example, in the age of telecommunications, and this is like a thing that I brought up multiple times. This is where technology matters. Once we entered the telecom age, so we had the telegraph going across the oceans, and we had increasingly high bandwidth ways of sending information around. Gold was no longer by itself the best ledger for doing things. We needed faster moving ledgers.
Hmm.
And that's where we gravitated toward originally the pound and then the dollar as kind of the big ledger to connect everything to and kind of price international contracts. And of course, that was based on gold. That was kind of abstraction over gold. And we kind of eventually defaulted and rug pulled that and just kind of had only the dollar itself. And my point is generally that one, that's a specific technological age. That's an age where we
Hmm.
had fast international transactions, but we had no way to send final irreversible value
Hmm.
at the speed of light, which Bitcoin, to some extent, I mean, to the extent that it keeps working, does. And so, in that kind of post telegraph pre Bitcoin world, we had a certain set of kind of technological limitations and a certain solution set to do with those. And unfortunately, that solution set, while it has advantages, it also has disadvantages like cumulative trade deficits, cumulative foreign ownership of US companies, um, cumulative punishing of certain
But
zip codes and rewarding
trade
of other
deficits
zip
can, in
codes.
theory, be stable for infinity as long as future productivity growth is greater than the account deficit. Like this is that you have to
And
consider the temporal factor here.
right, and as long as you're willing to have an increasingly large ownership, foreign ownership share of your corporations, and that's not going to be completely toxic at some point, and as long
Well, no,
as you're fine with
even that you could like if you're creating if you have positive if you have positive capital stock growth, growing population, like the economy is getting bigger, and so like the share is like there's always you can have an offsetting dilution like in theory like you could do this like forever like
again,
if certain
if you
things
manage
balance out in the future is what I'm saying.
right, if you're a philosopher king that can dial all these knobs perfectly for decades and multiple generations, then sure. But in practice, what we see is as you run structural trade deficits, your lower margin things suffer. This is not the US only phenomenon.
Yeah.
The foreign sector owns increasing shares of your capital stock.
Hmm.
Not all zip codes benefit evenly. So if you're in New York, you benefited from this for 50 years. If you're in the Midwest, you're the Rust Belt now. And so you siphon capital and put it somewhere else. And so as we enter a world where this has already been going on for a while. So it's not, again, we're not starting at day one here. We're starting after multiple decades of this kind of period of deindustrialization, structural trade deficits, high degree of political polarization. It's not an accident that people, I think, elected a president that often talked about the trade deficit from at that point. And so it's like you're,
But
as long as this arrangement now, let me
the
just
other way we can
just to
break even.
finish. Okay.
Okay, go ahead. No, I'm saying the other way we can break even. Sorry to cut you off. Is like we can inflate away our foreign obligations. Like we can break even through inflation, which again, like is what will happen. It's what happened after the Second World War. We basically inflated, like we printed a bunch of
Right,
money in the 50s to basically
right.
make up the difference, and the world was fine. It was actually, it ended up being fine. We did kind of end up paying back a lot of our foreign obligations as pennies on the dollar. If you look at what we how things actually
Yeah,
worked, and the world survived that and still continued to use the dollar for the rest of the century. So like that is
because there
also
was
some.
there was no competing ledger big enough, which is why they had to.
Yeah.
And so to finish my prior point, if people are fine with the current status quo, then I say keep it up. I mean, basically, these things are just going to keep happening. We're going to get widening wealth divides in the U.S. We're going to get some zip codes just absolutely crushing other zip codes. We're going to get just very low consumer sentiment. Um, People that have increasingly differing views of reality, let alone what should be done about the fact, but just they disagree on the set of facts. When you have the structural imbalances. So now that we're kind of like see something like an hour, 18 minutes into this, to tie it back to your point, why do I think Bitcoin's a good thing? I think because we had a certain set of technology, we used that technology. That technology had good things and bad things, including very large imbalances that have built up. And not just in the US, we just covered a lot of the US stuff, but also just globally, we have 100 plus different currency silos that exist, and they all have their little financial border around them, and they all have, they keep their population on this kind of treadmill of different speeds. The slowest speed would be like Japan's debasement rate. The fastest speed would be Iran or whatever the case is these days. Turkey and Argentina are always up there. Egypt somewhere in the middle to lower half. Um, Brazil somewhere in the middle to upper half, right? There's a spectrum
Mhm.
there for all these different currency silos. And so I generally hold a view that people are going to gravitate toward better units of account when available to them, which was a different set of options in the 1940s versus today.
Mhm.
um, and that attempts to, or at least draconian attempts to surveil everything about their life and then dictate every interaction that individuals and companies do with each other is overreach. And that it's not only unethical, but then sometimes untenable if technology for those things gets good enough that it just becomes very hard to enforce and very unpopular to enforce. And that I think a world of more decentralized options and more and kind of parallel options. If someone finds that their own local currency sucks, whether it's a really crappy situation or whether it's just the dollar, which is obviously not the worst. We live in the capital, but there are a lot of people on the wrong side of it, and it's not a good long-term savings vehicle.
Mhm.
And it's not something that if you're earning your wages in, you're still you're not keeping up generally with the gross money supply, so you're getting devalued versus some of the scarcest and more expensive things in society. You're having trouble keeping up with healthcare. You're having trouble keeping up with home values. You're keeping up with electronics. You're keeping up with grain prices. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think it's ethical to have sound open source money.
I don't have any issues with people saving money in different assets. I don't think people should be required to save in US dollars. I don't buy the argument that the dollar should be a good savings vehicle. I don't think that that's a necessary property of money. I do disagree though with the point that people on that side of the ledger, not just Bitcoin people, but sound money theorists of sort of um, in general, gold bugs, Peter Schiff, all that world. Like poor people don't have savings. They're living, they're living hand to mouth. And so and one of the things that people are ignoring is that in the inflationary crisis that we went through from 2020 in 2022 in the 18 to 24 months, and you can go and check my math on this. Price levels rose about 21% in that period, cumulatively, which was very high. But wages for the bottom quintile rose 34% in that time. Wages for the poorest Americans outpaced the price level in that period, and we see the effects of this. We see the consumer demand, which led to higher services inflation, and so this idea that inflation hurts the poor when it seems that low skill wages in a labor constrained economy tend to be the things that inflate the most, actually. So, like in that world, inflation actually was a transfer from the rich to the poor, not the other way around. And like people can put what I just said into ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever and check my math and find out that what I'm saying is true. Like poor people don't save; they only make wages, and poor people's wages go up the fastest. This is why Argentina, as an economy, hasn't collapsed, because even though they had 86% inflation, low skilled labor was like rising by 87 or 88% per year. It was slightly outpacing the price level. So like it only hurts people who choose to save in dollars, which almost nobody does. They put it in Robinhood or the stock market. So I kind of think what you're saying is like there should be this option available to save your money, but it's not actually something that people do, right? Poor people don't do it and rich people don't do it. They put their money, like you said, they put it in gold if they think the dollar is going to go down, or the stock market. So I just don't think that like that inflation bad for poor people is like as straightforward as an argument as it's made out to be in these discussions.
Right. So two quick points to that. One is I would say that my main pushback is that you stop at a convenient point, which is that as inflation slowed down. So in say 2021, we actually had pretty high consumer sentiment because to your point, the prices had it took time for the prices to start increasing at scale. People got kind of the benefits of the stimulus. Then, of course, partially for reasons that had nothing to do with inflation, partially just because of lockdown and stuff, we had, and then giving people money, we had a labor shortage which boosted those that were continuing to work at that time. And so for a while, it felt good. But then the problem is, even after we slow down the money supply growth, the inflationary effects from that period of money supply growth were not finished yet. For example, the price of insurance kept massively increasing in the
Mhm.
years that followed because it takes time for all that increased money to work its way through the system. The prices of beef kept increasing. Anything that to our earlier discussion, anything that involved either a lot of labor or somewhat scarce resources, kept grinding much higher up in price, even as the inflation, the money supply growth slowed down, even as the wage growth slowed down. And so that's why when you then continue that into 2023, 2024, and 2025, you start getting the consumer sentiment drastically rolls over. You go down to record low consumer sentiment because all that price increase was permanent and kept trickling out. And then they said, okay, well, now I can buy less house, less groceries, less this. When they increased in interest rates to try to contain inflation, it also put, taking out a new mortgage to buy a new house untenable for the bottom 70% of the population. It's fine for people that are buying houses in cash or that already locked in a mortgage prior to that rate hike. And so I say if you think that worked great and this is the political reality you're happy with, I say run it back again, keep doing it because
But if
as it
we,
goes
but
on,
a lot of these
that's
things,
going to
like
keep
the
happening.
insurance crisis, right? We have like a sort of an actuarial crisis with property insurance here in California. They have a similar one going in Florida. My understanding is though, like, how would fixed currency help? How would a fixed supply of currency, non-debasable currency, help with the incentives in those markets? Because, like, I mean, a lot of libertarian types don't like to talk about this, but like from what I hear, like climate change effects are driving a lot of it, like a lot of the massive increases in home insurance, like changes in rainfall patterns, like forest fires here in California, and running up against the sort of the regulated pricing mechanism of the regulators, like you require regulatory approval to increase premium levels and stuff, and all these things have sort of like created this like cauldron of solvency on the actual. But like how would like those things just like, I mean, there's just like a formula for insurance, and it doesn't really matter what you're denominating in. If your actuarial reality is moving against your actuarial theory of your insurance scheme, like it doesn't really matter like what you're denominating that insurance formula in. Like it would seem we'd still be having the same actuarial crisis in insurance.
Right, living in the most attractive and expensive parts of the country or the world is expensive. No one really, I don't think there's not magic button that fixes all of that. Now, what the part that I think affects it is you said before that you don't think the dollar should be a savings asset, really. That it's,
Yeah.
money doesn't have to be that. My point was that, well, the worse you make money as a savings asset, the more people are going to use other things as a savings asset,
Yeah.
of which real estate is among the most popular. So people are
Yeah.
going to inflate the value of homes relative to
Yeah.
incomes. They're going to own multiple other homes. They're going to buy property that they leave empty because it's better than holding dollars. They say,
Yeah.
well, it's a pretty scarce area, and so they're going to hold property empty. It's a use of resources, and so it contributes to high home to income ratios, and it's one of the downsides.
But
And to
isn't
my
but
prior
isn't isn't restriction of housing supply like by through land use restrictions like the bigger factor than monetary inflation?
Well, partially what encourages, like, so for example, NIMBYism is a big issue in the US, which is
Mhm.
that people don't often will block construction of new housing because they want to preserve the value of their house. And
Absolutely.
there's some degree of that is inevitable. People, of course, want to preserve what they have. But when real estate is their primary store of value,
Mhm.
because the money is not a good store of value, and other things are generally volatile, um, that's going to increase NIMBYism. That's that,
Mhm.
when real estate is the biggest thing in your net worth, you're going to fight tooth and nail for it. Whereas if you treat it more like a durable good, a utility good, and you suck some of the monetary premium out of it, it reduces the incentives for NIMBYism. It doesn't eliminate them, but it reduces them. So there are basically, to finish my point, there are consequences for having weak money and then monetizing other things that are often of kind of essential value.
Well, it just needs to be said that like the Keynesian view is that like that it, like what you're saying, like you're incentivized to save in other assets is intentional, right? Like Keynes said this is a good thing. Even Milton Friedman, by the way, who came up with the 2% inflation target in the monitor school, believes even the monetarists, the Chicago schoolers, who are a little bit more stricter than the Keynesians, think that a little bit of this is good. That you want to lower the hurdle rate to risk taking through some slow, stable monetary debasement. So like that is like a so like if you know, a Keynesian economist were here, they would say, yes, yes, this is we are discouraging you from saving and buy tips, buy treasury inflation protected thing or something. There are instruments that will protect you from price inflation, including some pretty safe options. You mentioned gold. And like the Keynesian would be like, yeah, yeah, do that if that's what you want. Like they're like they don't disagree with that. They just think that like that the currency shouldn't be a savings vehicle like that like the Keynesian hears that and they're like, yes, that's a good thing, like that, like and I know that like people, sound money theorists, are like, that's insane, that's crazy, but I mean like there's a reason for it, right? Which is that like you want to make the cost of taking a risk to try a new business, to try and invent a new technology, you want to, yes, take, you know, use use like a slow inflation rate to lower the hurdle rate to risk taking, to continually have some of that in your economy, to juice the wheels, to heat up the animal spirits, John Maynard Keynes said.
Right, but if that theory I think had merit in reality, we would generally see a correlation between weaker money periods and more innovation, and sounder money periods and less innovation. Whereas when you look in history, for example, in the late 1800s in the U.S., we had very sound money, and yet, I mean, we had the massive build out of the railroad system in the U.S. and
Hmm.
globally. So massive investment. I mean, there's some, because of the current topic of AI capex. It's very popular to compare AI capex to prior major investment cycles in history. Building out the fiber optics, building out the highway system, building out the Manhattan Project or the Apollo program. The railroads, by estimates I've seen, have been like kind of the biggest modern investment
But
cycle, and that was under a period of sound money.
that
And
was,
so
but that was
people,
also the period where the wealth disparity in this country was, I mean, it's actually worse today, but like if you want to find a period where the separation between the rich and the poor was as almost as bad as it was today, you'd go to the late 1890s, right? The incredibly corrupt political economy, a lot of this, you know, contributed to the assassination of President Garfield, the passage of the Pendleton Act, the robber baron era. You're talking about what we call the robber baron era, where
Right. But
basically
they were
like
also the
a
people
few
that
bunch
filled
of
out.
people. You had 200 members of Congress. Historians think like literally on the payroll of these like rich sort of capitalist barons that like Ayn Rand sort of like idealized in her in her writings, like Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Like, I mean, there's another view of that period. Like, people got really angry. Like, this country was like on the verge of exploding in revolution, which led to the government like heavily regulating and breaking up these monopolies. And like, I mean, so you're pointing to this period as sort of like a golden age, but like the bottom 90% of American society at the time thought it was a pretty shitty time to live. And like, which is like, we're lucky we didn't have a communist revolution. Like, it went another way, and we had a sort of more liberal
Right.
thing. So
So
like, I don't know that that's a good period to point to.
Right. So I'm going to finish the point, which is because the initial point, because we jump around so quickly and people kind of lose track of what was being discussed. My point, the initial claim was that kind of we need debasing money to want to invest and do big things and drive technological growth.
Hmm.
My counterpoint was that if that were the case, one would think that the periods of sound money would be associated with less investment and technological growth. Whereas in this kind of modern period where we had sound money, that was one of our rapid periods of technological growth. That was electrification. That was railroads. That was the automobile. That was using hydrocarbons and building out all of the pipeline system. Those robber barons, they were, driving industry forward and investing heavily in a sound money environment because they perceived correctly that there would be major returns from it. And when we talk about wealth divide, that is true. That's partially a taxing policy and other policies involved there. But that's separate from the idea that you need weak money to encourage investment. But then two, there's two different situations with the widening wealth divide. You can have a situation where the bottom is stagnating or going down in wealth and living standards, while a small minority is rapidly
Living standards
increasing.
were
Or
stagnating in
or
the
or
1890s.
or you can have a scenario where both are rising, but the top is rising much quicker. And today we have weak money, and to your point, we have even wider wealth divide, and yet we find that the bottom is stagnating. The second kind of period I point to is that throughout much of the Dark Ages in Europe, you had really bad coinage. You had generally
Mhm.
silver coinage, local mints, no good standards, generally low quality, like very diluted, clipped often. Charlemagne tried to then standardize it. He made it a little bit better, but it was still bad. The attractive coinage was from the Byzantine area that would kind of leak into the broader Europe, as well as the Islamic era.
Mhm.
They had good gold coinage that would leak into Europe as well. And when you had finally the rise of the gold florin in the 1200s, that caught on, and you had kind of a kind of an increased sort of monetary renaissance in undebased, very pure gold coinage.
Mhm.
And it's not that long after that you got the actual Renaissance, right? So you had a massive increase in cultural technology, all sorts of stuff that we generally associate as good things happened during this kind of unusually sound monetary period in
Mhm.
Europe that there was a big departure from the prior multiple centuries of bad coinage and unsound money. So I think that there's a lack of historical argument for why we need to constantly debase people's savings and wages. Because again, it's not just their savings; it's their wages for poor people that we're debasing here. Because that's every contract that they do, everything that they agree with employers to get paid is that what we as kind of quote unquote central planners in this Keynesian sense are debasing to encourage investment. And I just don't think the history is there for it. But again, people, of course, will debate endlessly about this. Someone from a more limited government school versus a bigger government school, or Austrians versus Keynesian, these people will debate. My point is that the problem with the Keynesian school is that they can talk all they want about what the optimal kind of monetary debasement rate should be, and generally argue
Mhm.
for their higher debasement rate that they do. People will the natural incentives, especially because Keynesians don't control everything in society as much as sometimes they'd like to, people will try to gravitate towards sounder monies. And so then the problem becomes that the proponents of the Keynesians have to argue why we need all these financial surveillance and borders and restrictions to stop people from gravitating away from that, kind of finely tuned debasement situation that they've set up, which again might not even be historically useful, I would argue, but that's aside. The effort really becomes on them to try to enforce why this is necessary and why their controls to keep it in check are ethical, enforceable, and all that.
There's this thing here too, like you mentioned the 1890s, the robber baron era. Obviously, we had a this all kind of, we had a big economic boom in the 20s, in the 1920s, and then the crash. Um, and like isn't the Great Depression, the fact that like the Federal Reserve did the opposite of what Ben Bernanke did in 2008. They tightened money supply, in response to the crisis, which accelerated. It forced a bunch of banks into insolvency, because there was just no liquidity. And so we did the thing where, the sound money theorists were advocating for in 2008, which was to let the bad banks die, and to let, not have any moral hazard, and let the market work out its malinvestment. I mean, that's what happened basically under Hoover. Like initially, the Federal Reserve tightened policy and tried to focus on maintaining the value of the currency. And Bernanke and like most economists today believe that's what led to the Great Depression, which is why they did the opposite. They printed as much money as they could, as fast as they could. And like we had a pretty good decade of prosperity until COVID. And so this idea that like that this like that the sort of the sound money theory as sort of providing a better foundation, we kind of did the A/B test. We did the thing that Ron Paul said we should do, which was like hold the money, focus on keeping the value of the dollar high, which is what happened under Hoover, and the economy collapsed. We saw unemployment rates go above 30%, and we lived through a period of economic malaise, the worst of which in the last several hundred years. So what is the response to that observation? Like, what am I getting wrong?
Right. So two things. One, your prior point about the 1890s. That whole period of sound money and technological rapid development, that was when the United States became the largest economy in the world. So we can talk about how bad that period was. It wasn't just one decade; it was multiple decades from
Hmm.
kind of, let's say, post Civil War all the way up to the early 1900s. Was this period of quite sound money, quite rapid investing in technology and growth, and a rising of what was kind of a global backwater into a massive manufacturing, technological, and economic power. Despite, of course,
Hmm.
that there are many frictions that come with that. I mean, there's environmental and industrialization issues. There's all manner of stuff that, I mean, China kind of ran through that playbook when they went through the whole sweatshop era as well. So there obviously are downsides to that sort of rapid development, but that's one point. The second point is when it comes to the Great Depression, we have to remember we can conveniently start what happened at the moment of the crash, but we have to, of course, say, well, were they practicing sound money leading up to the crash? Well, at that point, we had just, in 1913, we had centralized our money under the Federal Reserve.
Hmm.
Then, of course, Europe and then the United States got involved in World War One, where, especially in Europe, but also in the U.S., we rapidly increased the money supply uh, without, kind of officially affecting the gold peg. We made it much harder, especially like in the UK and Europe. All those currencies broke. UK struggled after the war to try to. They were like denial about trying to get back to the same gold peg because even though they had rapidly increased the money supply, they were like, no, we got to keep our like peg in place, but it's already done. Like you should have decided that before the war to decide to get involved. So then they create bubbles because they create all this money, but they're still trying to claim it's still the same amount of gold. But then they're putting restrictions, and then you get a ton of flow into the United States, partially because we're economically booming, but also because you had these bubbles in Europe. And then we had centralized all of our money, and then we
Mhm.
got a massive credit bubble. And so when you get to the point where you've already debased your currency rapidly, you've already encouraged massive debt buildup. You haven't practiced sound money in that kind of decade leading up to it, as you kind of got all these credit bubbles. Um, Once you're already levered 30 to 1, you're already screwed. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not that you can get to 30 to 1 leverage and then say, "Oh, now we're going to practice sound money and we're not going to print ever." That
Well,
is how you
we
contribute to the Great
we passed
Depression.
Dodd-Frank, which limits it to 10-1, right? That was the maximum for tier, like, you have to have a 10 to 1 is like the maximum that's now allowed for large
Right, we've
institutions.
we've reduced yeah, we've reduced it kind of post. I'm talking about the Great Depression peak,
Yeah.
and I'm also talking about the 2008 peak. These were much more levered. And again, it's not my number was not just broad money to base money.
Yeah.
It was all the IOUs, including in securities market, right? So all the total debt outstanding relative to the number of base units in the system. I mean, in
Mhm.
the global financial crisis, that hit 50 or 60 to 1. The broad money to base money was something like 20 to 1. In the Great Depression, you had similarly high numbers, not quite as high, but you had unusually high numbers in the late 20s leading up to that, and that's a kind of a product of central bank creation and in Keynesianism. So it's not just what you do. It's not like this problem didn't disappear out of nowhere. There were conditions that led up to it, and then there are of course solutions you can struggle
But
with after the fact.
the immediate post-war period, right? Post 1945, we get the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Japan, and a lot of that is done on the backs of U.S. taxpayers, in addition to the cost of the war, which we inflated a lot of it away, right? I mean, um, so in the we had the 1950s and 1960s, at least up until the late 1960s, was a good almost 2 decades stretch of like massively increasing prosperity, the rise of the American middle class, the rebuilding of Europe, the reindustrialization of and hyper industrialization of Japan. And a lot of that was done through printing a lot of money. And, of course, we get, to the oil shock in 1973, which hits really hard. And that happens 2 years after the end of the close of the Bretton Woods window. Not completely disconnected events, but like the world created a lot of wealth and we built the entire middle class sort of like, you know, in in a world of Keynesian monetary policy. So um, and then you have another example, which is Japan, right, in the 21st century, where they have like sticky deflation, and the Japanese central bank. I mean, until after COVID, basically, which broke the cycle for them, they were in a period where they were printing money and they couldn't get people to spend it. Prices just kept falling. It didn't
They
matter
were
how much
printing
money
money. They had the slowest money supply growth in the world for like from 2000 to
No,
2020.
no,
They
they're
did.
buying government debt, right? You got
I know, but look
200%,
at the
like, yeah,
look. You or anyone in the audience, look up Japan's M2 money supply growth from 2020 to from 2000 to 2022.
yeah, but that's not all the money. It includes the sovereign debt that they're keeping on their balance sheet, right? Which is over the 200%, like debt to GDP ratio, and a lot of that just being completely monetized, and still like those mass that fiscal account situation is is
Yeah,
is,
they were
is
running.
exist
They were
is
running.
existing is existing at a time of falling consumer prices, which goes against this idea that like government deficits equal higher consumer inflation,
No, it
because we've seen
aligns
the
with it
opposite
perfectly.
in
They
Japan.
they had they had policies that, as a combination, led to the slowest money supply growth in the world, and then shockingly, they had deflation compared to every other country. Because what a
Mhm.
lot of people miss with pretty simplistic analysis is that going into 1990, they had the biggest private sector debt bubble in the history of the world,
Mhm.
bigger than 2009 in the U.S., bigger than 1929 in the U.S. They had the biggest like comparative bubble in the world, real estate and equities and debt levels. So then, whenever you destroy debt, you end up destroying money. And so over the course of the 90s and the 2000s, you had a massive private sector deleveraging, which
Mhm.
is massively deflationary on both the money supply and prices. Then they
Mhm.
were offsetting it by running larger fiscal deficits, which on net roughly balanced it out. And so you
Mhm.
got something like 3% average money supply growth per year from, say, the mid 90s or 2000. all the way up to pre-COVID. So you had multiple
Mhm.
decades of this private sector debt bubble melting
Mhm.
and fiscal offsetting it. So you get very low money supply growth and you get very limited inflation.
Yeah, but M2,
And you have
but
other
M2,
factors.
but M2 is not like the total money supply, right? Like these are it's a different measure of like um a type of money in the financial system.
The most liquid type of money, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But like I mean
That's the
like
money that people get paid and that's what they save in.
yeah, but like most of the money that central banks create is like not that. That's like an emergent thing that kind of happens in the banking system. Like, a loan gets
And it doesn't
created
get,
and the money
yeah,
gets spent in the economy and it kind of becomes part of the M2 calculation is like a weird thing. But like in theory, like you could like, inflate, M1 like by some like absurd amount and M2 wouldn't move that much because of like
yeah.
the
Because
dynamics
it
of the
doesn't, yeah.
system.
Because
Like, I mean,
M1's
like,
not what impacts inflation, M2 is. A lot
yeah.
more than
So,
inflation.
yeah. But I mean, like, these things are like really sophisticated. Lynn, you haven't convinced me that we should switch to Bitcoin. You have convinced me that like people and that should potentially use it when they need it outside the world. And it was like really great of you to come on and have this discussion. It's important. It's important to have these discussions. I hope
Sure.
everyone thinks this was an honest discussion. I think Lynn did great, and I thank her for joining me here at Notes from the Circus. Lynn, where can people find you?
People can go to linalden.com and see my work there. They can check out Broken Money on Amazon or elsewhere if they'd like to learn about money from my perspective and historical perspective. And thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lynn. And thank you, America. We'll see you again soon. Have a great Sunday.